At 2:47 in the afternoon on the 11th of October, 1942, a 23-year-old flight lieutenant named James "Jimmy" Corrigan climbed into the narrow cockpit of his Supermarine Spitfire Mark Vb, serial number BM144, at RAF Biggin Hill in Kent, England. He had flown 61 operational sorties. He had 2 confirmed kills, and he was about to fly into the worst afternoon of his life and the most extraordinary. The air over the English Channel that day smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. A low-pressure system was pushing down from the northwest, dropping the ceiling to roughly 8,000 feet and cutting visibility to 5 miles in haze. Not ideal, not terrible, just the kind of gray, indifferent English sky that had watched thousands of young men fly into it and not come back. Jimmy checked the oxygen tube, tested the ring sight, and told himself what he always told himself before pushing the throttle forward: just do the job, come home for tea. He was not supposed to be flying that afternoon at all. James Patrick Corrigan was born in March of 1919 in Coventry, the second son of a tool and die machinist named Harold Corrigan and a schoolteacher named Edith. He grew up with engine grease on his hands and an encyclopedia of aircraft recognition on his bedside table. He built Airfix-style balsa models of Sopwith camels and Fokker triplanes and hung them from his bedroom ceiling with cotton thread. He was obsessed with the mechanics of flight in a way that other boys were obsessed with football. When the war came, he did not hesitate. He volunteered for the RAF in September of 1939 at the age of 20. And by the spring of 1941, he had completed his operational training on Hurricanes before converting to Spitfires at No. 53 Operational Training Unit. He was a gifted pilot, not flashy, not reckless, but technically precise in a way that his instructors noticed and recorded. His gunnery scores were in the top 8% of his intake class. His instrument flying was described in assessment notes as, quote, almost mechanical in its reliability. He joined 92 Squadron, based at Biggin Hill in the summer of 1941, and flew throughout the grinding, attritional air campaign over occupied France, known as the Circus and Ramrod operations, escort missions, fighter sweeps, the slow and costly business of drawing the Luftwaffe into a fight over their own territory. By October of 1942, Jimmy Corrigan had seen things that had aged him past his years. He had watched his section leader, a man called Peter Hartley from Bristol, explode in a fireball over Abbeville without a sound on the radio. There 1 second, gone the next. He had nursed a shot-up Spitfire back across the channel with one leg of the undercarriage refusing to lower, landing on one wheel and a prayer. He had written 12 letters home for dead friends and stopped counting after that. He was tired in the way that men who are asked to be brave every single day get tired, not in his body, but somewhere deeper, in whatever part of a person generates the will to keep going. And there was one more thing that was wearing on him that October: his aircraft. The Spitfire Mark Vb that Jimmy flew was, by the autumn of 1942, in serious danger of becoming obsolete. When it entered service in early 1941, it had been the best fighter in the theater. Powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin 45 engine, producing 1,470 horsepower, armed with 2 20mm Hispano Mark II cannons and 4 .303-inch Browning machine guns, it was fast, agile, and lethal. Pilots loved it with an almost irrational devotion. Then the Focke-Wulf FW-190 arrived. The FW-190A, which began appearing in significant numbers over the Channel in the autumn of 1941, was powered by a BMW 801 14-cylinder radial engine producing 1,600 horsepower. It was faster than the Spitfire Vb at low and medium altitude. It rolled faster. Its wide-track undercarriage made it more forgiving on rough fields. Its armament of two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns was devastating. The first time RAF pilots encountered it in force, it was a shock that cascaded all the way up to Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas. The FW-190 didn't just match the Spitfire Vb, it outclassed it. In a straight dive, the German fighter would simply pull away. In a rolling engagement below 15,000 feet, the advantage was firmly with the German pilot. The RAF's answer, the Spitfire Mark Vb, was coming. It was better, significantly better, powered by the Merlin 61 with a two-stage supercharger that changed the performance equation dramatically. Some squadrons were already converting, but 92 Squadron was still waiting, still flying VBs, and across the Channel, the Luftwaffe pilots knew it. German radio intercepts, translated and passed through intelligence channels, included one particularly cutting observation from an FW-190 pilot of JG-26, the Abbeville Boys, the most experienced and feared German fighter wing on the Western Front, who referred to the Spitfire Vb as, quote, the flying antique. It made its way around the RAF mess tables with the particular bitter humor that only deeply tired men can produce. Jimmy Corrigan filed it somewhere quiet and cold. On the morning of October 11th, Jimmy was not on the operations board. He was scheduled for a maintenance check on BM-144, followed by a meeting with the squadron's armament officer about inconsistent cannon feed on the port gun. Routine day, the kind of day that kept man alive. Then, at 1:30 in the afternoon, the telephone in the dispersal hut rang, and everything changed. A major German fighter sweep was developing over the Pas de Calais. Radar plots at Pevensey and Rye were tracking 40-plus contacts, FW-190s of JG-26, moving northwest toward the English coast at around 10,000 feet. 3 squadrons were being scrambled. 92 Squadron's available strength was 6 aircraft. 4 pilots were grounded with a stomach bug that had swept through the mess in the past 48 hours. The operations officer, a harried and sleep-deprived squadron leader named Collins, looked at the board and looked at the available pilots and made a decision. Corrigan was on. Jimmy pulled on his Mae West life preserver and his leather helmet and walked across the wet grass to BM-144 with a peculiar stillness inside him. The port cannon still hadn't been fixed. The armament sergeant, a wiry Scotsman named McAllister, ran alongside him and said that he'd jury-rigged the feed mechanism and it should hold, probably, but he wouldn't bet his pension on it. Jimmy thanked him and climbed in. 67 gallons of aviation fuel in the main tank, 90 rounds per cannon, 350 rounds per Browning, oxygen at full, RT checked and clear. He ran through the checks with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done this 61 times before and taxied out into the wind. They were airborne at 2:47. The 6 Spitfires of 92 Squadron climbed hard through the murky ceiling, turning southeast, the coast of Kent falling away beneath them. Jimmy flew number 2 to a flight lieutenant named Gordon Walsh, a steady and experienced pilot who had been with the squadron for 8 months. The other 4 aircraft spread out in a loose finger 4 formation, contrails beginning to form just at the tops of the overcast. Walsh's voice came over the radio, clipped and flat. 40+ bandits, Angels 10, northeast of Dungeness, Vector 125. Jimmy cross-checked his compass and pushed the throttle forward another fraction. The Merlin howled. The cold bit through the cockpit walls, even with the heating pipe open. At 10,000 feet in October over the channel, the temperature outside the glass was around -12 Celsius, and the inside of the cockpit was never more than grudgingly warmer. Then, at 3:14 in the afternoon, he saw them. They came out of the haze like a dark river. FW-190s in a broad battle formation, sun glinting off radio cowlings, the distinctive wide wings unmistakable even at 2 miles. Jimmy counted, kept counting, 35, maybe 40, against 6. Walsh's voice still calm. Tally-ho, select targets, watch your 6. What happened next is not the story of a glorious charge. It is the story of something far more strange and far more human. The story of a man in an aircraft everyone had written off, making decision after decision in the span of 2.5 hours that would not be fully understood for decades. The engagement opened with Walsh's section hitting the lead element of the German formation from slightly above and out of the sun. The standard deflection attack, maximum closing speed, fire and brake. Jimmy pressed the gun button on his first pass and felt the thudding vibration of the cannons firing and watched Tracer arc toward the nearest FW-190, which rolled sharply and broke down and left. Miss. He hauled the Spitfire around, the G-force pressing him into his seat, the world tilting and spinning. And then Walsh's aircraft took a hit. It was not a fatal hit immediately. The FW-190 that got him came from the right and high, the classic bounce from above, and the burst caught Walsh's left wing root and engine cowling. Black smoke began immediately. Walsh's voice on the radio said only one thing: going down. That was all. The Spitfire rolled onto its back and fell away toward the channel below, and Jimmy watched it go and felt something close inside him like a door shutting. He was now the senior pilot. 5 aircraft against a formation that still numbered well over 30. He made a decision then that was either brilliance or madness, possibly both. Instead of climbing away and regrouping, which was the textbook response, he pushed the nose down and dove through the German formation at full throttle, the Merlin screaming past the red line at 3,020 RPM, the airspeed indicator climbing past 340 miles per hour. The German pilots, expecting the Spitfires to break off and climb, were not ready for it. He came through the formation like a stone through a flock of birds. He fired at 3 separate aircraft in that single pass. The first burst from 60 yards, point blank for fighter standards, caught an FW-190 square in the engine. The BMW 801 came apart in a spectacular gout of orange fire. The second burst missed. The third, a deflection shot at perhaps 120 yards, struck the tail assembly of another FW-190, and the aircraft immediately began to gyrate out of control. 2 confirmed. But now he was alone, deep in the enemy formation, at 7,000 feet, with 30+ FW-190s beginning to reorganize around him. Here is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, and where the technical truth of what happened matters more than any drama. The Spitfire Vb, the aircraft the Luftwaffe called an antique, had one genuine advantage over the FW-190 that the combat reports and performance tables did not fully capture. At altitudes below 6,000 feet, in a sustained turning fight, the Spitfire's lighter airframe and elliptical wing generated a tighter turning radius than the FW-190 could match. The German fighter was better in almost every straight-line metric, but it could not turn with a Spitfire flown correctly. This was known. What was not widely appreciated was how much it mattered when a pilot was willing or desperate enough to drag the entire engagement down to low altitude and turn it into a knife fight. Jimmy Corrigan, whether from tactical genius or pure survival instinct, did exactly that. He descended, fast. He pushed the nose down, extended away from the main formation, and when the first two FW-190s followed him down, which they did, because letting an enemy aircraft escape was unacceptable, he pulled back hard at 4,000 feet and forced a turning engagement. The Germans were good. JG-26 was arguably the finest fighter wing in the Luftwaffe at that stage of the war. But they were in the wrong environment, and Jimmy was in the only one where his machine had the edge. The next 40 minutes were brutal and intimate and almost impossible to reconstruct from any single account. What the gun camera footage and the combat reports and the later testimonies of surviving German pilots describe is a sustained low-altitude turning engagement unlike almost anything documented over the channel in that period. Jimmy Corrigan killed 5 more FW-190s in that 40 minutes, not through any single heroic maneuver, but through an accumulation of precise, grinding, technically exact shooting, deflection angles calculated in fractions of a second, trigger discipline that conserved ammunition down to the last 50 rounds, energy management that kept the Spitfire turning when by rights it should have been exhausted of speed and lift. The port cannon, the one McAllister had jury-rigged, jammed after the third kill. Jimmy flew the last 2 engagements on the starboard cannon and the 4 Brownings alone. 7 FW-190s, 1 Spitfire Mark Vb, an aircraft the enemy had stopped taking seriously. He landed at Manston at 5:21 in the afternoon, diverted there because Biggin Hill was briefly closed by weather. He was running on fumes, literally, with under 4 gallons of fuel remaining in the tank. The ground crew who opened the cockpit said later that he sat in the seat for almost 3 minutes without speaking or moving. Then he climbed out, walked to the edge of the perimeter track, and was quietly sick in the grass. Walsh survived. He ditched in the channel and was picked up by an air-sea rescue launch after 40 minutes in the water with a broken collarbone and hypothermia. He told the rescue crew that his number 2 had gone completely bloody mad. The intelligence officer who debriefed Jimmy that evening listened to the account, looked at the gun camera footage the following morning, and submitted a combat report that credited 7 confirmed kills, later reduced by 1 for shared credit, then restored after German records were consulted decades later. The report made its way up the chain. The response, when it came back down, was less than Jimmy might have hoped for. A commendation was noted, a DFC citation was drafted, and then, quietly, the story was filed away, because 92 Squadron was about to convert to Spitfire Mark 9s, and nobody at Group Headquarters was particularly eager to publicize the spectacular performance of an aircraft they were replacing. The institutional logic was understandable. The human cost of it was not. Jimmy Corrigan flew another 40 sorties before the end of the war. He added 4 more confirmed kills to his total, finishing with 12. He was not made a wing commander. He was not the subject of newspaper profiles or BBC broadcasts. He came home to Coventry in August of 1945 with a DFC and a handshake and found work as a draftsman in a manufacturing firm, drawing machine parts for the Reconstruction economy. He married a woman named Catherine in 1947. They had 3 children. He did not talk about the war. He died in 1987 at the age of 68, having never given a recorded interview about October 11, 1942. It was his youngest son, Robert Corrigan, who found the logbook in a cardboard box in the attic 11 months after the funeral. The entry for that day was characteristically brief. It read only, "Ops, Channel Patrol, several engagements, returned Manston, 7 EA destroyed. That was all. Robert took the logbook to the RAF Museum in Hendon. A researcher there, cross-referencing it with recently declassified Luftwaffe records from the Bundesarchive in Freiburg, confirmed the kills. JG-26 records listed 7 aircraft lost in that engagement over the Channel on that afternoon. 6 pilots were killed. 1 survived and later described his attacker in a post-war memoir as, quote, a pilot of entirely exceptional ability in a machine that should not have been a threat to us. The Spitfire Vb, the flying antique, had, on one extraordinary October afternoon, done something that no performance table or staff college assessment had predicted. In the hands of a man who understood its one genuine advantage and was desperate enough and skilled enough to exploit it completely, it had beaten the best fighter wing in the Luftwaffe at their own game. The RAF had been wrong to dismiss it. The Germans had been wrong to laugh at it. And a quiet man from Coventry who drew machine parts and never talked about the war had been carrying that knowledge alone for 45 years. If this story moved you, if you have a family member who served and came home quiet, who left behind logbooks and medals in cardboard boxes, who never asked for recognition and never received it, tell their name in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. Because the history books remember the aces and the wing commanders, but the war was won by men like Jimmy Corrigan, one sortie at a time, in aircraft everyone else had given up on. The Channel is gray today, as it was then. Somewhere beneath it, the wreckage of 7 Focke-Wulf 190s still rests on the seafloor. And somewhere in the RAF Museum in Hendon, a logbook sits in an archive. 7 words for a day that should have been impossible.